Is Thomas Santamaria. Mr. Santamaria is a doctoral candidate in Renaissance Studies and History at Yale, and I think maybe equally important, at least in this venue, the first Gritsch Scholar. The Funds Fellowship is meant to support the work of scholars early in their careers whose research projects in early modern and Reformation studies would benefit from the opportunity to study for an extended period of time on site at archives, universities, and other research institutes in Europe. Thomas's application was appealing, and his tenure as the first Gritsch Fellow will certainly set a standard for future awardees. So today we have the triple pleasure, or at least I do, because I had not met Thomas before, of welcoming him in person and hearing of his scholarship. Moving from the miraculous to the sensual, and he will speak to us today on to see or not to see Catholic reformers, the census, and the Tridentine orthopraxis. Mr. Secretary.
In some ways, titles are obsolete as soon as you make them. And I adjusted mine a little bit to see or not see. What on earth am I seeing? Because I think that's what we're going to get into a little bit. Well, first I do want to thank Carlos, who actually encouraged me to be a Gritsch Fellow, to apply. I said, I'm not really sure that they would want me. And he said, no, go ahead. And in fact, as a testament, I think, to Eric Gritsch's work in ecumenism, I was taken, even though here I am really working on the Catholic Reformation. But also thanks to Carlos, who I admit is a hard act to follow, for really being a very great mentor. And then, of course, thanks to Paul and especially Bonnie, who have supported me so much, but also made Baltimore and this place very welcoming to me. So I greatly appreciate that. And then to all of you for the support, because it brought me to Rome on a few occasions to undertake these desperately difficult research. There were a few gelatos, a few cappuccinos, and more beside.
Well, it's offensive.
The gustatory sense was in full action, no doubt. And anyway, though, it wasn't just culinary delights that brought me to Rome. I was spending some time in the archives and rare book libraries of the Capodimonte. Here pictured is the entrance to the Vatican Library and Archives. And in this research, I turned to what I believe was the pressing issue for Catholic reformers in the period following the Council of Trent, after 1563 and maybe until and beyond 1621. How to communicate the beliefs and corresponding practices of the Roman Catholic faith to the laity. It was not enough for various groups of the most learned churchmen to read the works of Protestant reformers and respond to them in the city of Trent for a period of nearly 20 years. They had to determine how they were going to disseminate those ideas, how they were going to teach them to the average Christian so that he could be inspired to a greater piety and love for God. The approach they embraced was a multimedia one, and they used every form of information dissemination known to them: the printing press, the classroom, the pulpit, and the arts. Today I'm going to argue that the multi-pronged approach was both sensorial in its nature, but also targeted directly toward the senses. That is to say, the reformers instructed Christians about how to live by guiding them toward the appropriate use of the body at the level of the senses. As the story unfolds, what I think will become clear is that it's easier to misuse the senses than to use them appropriately. The path between applying the senses and avoiding them is a treacherous one that could lead to both confusion and conflict. To explore this issue, I focus on the works of some Jesuit preachers and spiritual writers, as well as some artworks in the latter half. In particular, my research focuses on the work of the Jesuit Robert Bellarmine, who was the most outstanding Catholic theologian of his day. Yet to study Bellarmine is a process of retrieval, because the Jesuits, their founder, Ignatius Loyola and Bellarmine, are all mired in myth as a result of centuries-old misnomers. Therefore, just as Ignatius's biographer, Pedro de Ribadeneira, and he wrote Ignatius' biography 12 times, promised to set the founder before the eyes of his readers as he saw and heard him, I hope to offer a fuller picture of Robert Bellarmine, his thought, and the Catholic reform effort by examining the role of the senses as a theme in his spiritual texts and sermons. And by the way, the sermons add up to about 11 volumes. The most enduring images of these Jesuits have been as theological controversialists who strove to rid Christianity of Protestant heresy. They've also been known as schoolmasters and zealous missionaries. Illustrative of this legacy is the semi-official portrait sculpture of Ignatius Loyola, pictured here, located in St. Peter's Basilica. Ignatius here is literally stomping on heretics. You see his head is on, his foot is on their head. That image actually originates in Ribadeneira's Life of Ignatius, which increasingly over the 12 retries portrayed him as a hyper-Orthodox, miracle-working saint. But it did conceal Ignatius's frequent conflicts with the Inquisition. It wasn't just Teresa of Avila or Maria de Agreda. It was pretty much any saint that came up. Filippo Neri, many of them were in front of the Inquisition many times. The sculpture distorts the mission of many early Jesuits who were dedicated to spiritual rejuvenation through ministries of the word, preaching, sacred lectures, spiritual conversation, catechism, giving the spiritual exercises, not to controversial theology. There's almost nothing in Ignatius's writings about controversial theology, that is, refuting Protestantism. Similarly, the Bellarmine myths amplify his role as a controversialist, he really was, political theologian, and inquisitor, and they minimize his place as an acclaimed author of devotional texts and a prodigious preacher. The popular image of Bellarmine, created by admiring historians and detractors alike, muted the role of spiritual texts and emphasized his theological controversialism, his role in the Galileo affair, and his political theology. He became the enemy of science and the enemy of Protestantism. To some degree, the Jesuits themselves promoted this image. In the first printed biography of Robert Bellarmine, Giacomo Fuligati included a woodcut of picturing Bellarmine, whose caption reads, it's here in Latin, but I'll translate it. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine of the Society of Jesus, you obliterate all the errors and cunning of Luther and Calvin. The image reflects the fact that his most famous work among academics today and in his own time are his controversies, in which he refutes those the Protestant theological critiques and defends traditional Catholic. An historian of the Society of Jesus, Pietro Tacchi Venturi, could not resist republishing the same woodcut in his apology for Bellarmine's canonization. The effort to canonize Bellarmine in the late 19th and early 20th century yielded many hagiographic works intended to inspire devotion and promote his cult. The renewed interest in Bellarmine leading to his canonization was entwined with papal politics. For Pius XI, Bellarmine represented a triumphant and intellectually rigorous church able to obliterate its enemies, defeat secularism, and conquer the still young nation of Italy to the Catholic fold. Since then, scholars have largely maintained the biographer's narrow interest in Bellarmine's controversies, the Galileo affair, and Bellarmine's political theology, with few exceptions. This is true, for example, of 3 volumes published after conference proceedings in the 1980s, excepting 2 essays that briefly mention the 5 ascetical writings that he made at the end of his life. The volumes pay no attention to his preaching and spiritual writing. Only a few scholars noted that this was a sad lack. The 2 most recent English language monographs on Bellarmine also did not mention the spiritual writings and sermons. In his book, Same Censor, on Bellarmine's role in the Galileo trial, Peter Godwin criticized the hagiographers of science, as he calls them, arguing that Bellarmine was not a severe figure squashing freedom of thought, and claims that Galileo received only a gentle rap over the knuckles. Stefania Tutino examined Bellarmine's role as a critical political thinker, unafraid of challenging certain tenets of papal authority. Both of these accounts recovered a more accurate picture of the historical person. And then early in the 20th century, a few French and German Jesuits, Xavier-Marie Le Bachelet and Emmerich Reitz von Frentz, actually finally turned their attention to some of Bellarmine's devotional texts. But these were two short articles in the early 20th century. But they do reflect Bellarmine's autobiography and his self-understanding. In his autobiography, Bellarmine depicts himself as a minister, not a controversial theologian. For example, he offered detailed accounts of his preaching activity in every city he visited. To summarize that activity, he preached frequently, drew enormous crowds, and was proud of his achievements as a preacher. This humble man, and he was known for his humility, even boasted of one sermon event where he so moved the crowd that they wished to kiss his hand after the sermon. The dream of every preacher, but the reality of rock stars. Even though Bellarmine was admired for his humility, it's so clear he was proud of this, and his other ascetical writings as well. In his preface to The Mind's Ascent, he wrote, "I do not know how others will judge this book, but I have found it very useful compared to my other smaller works. I do not read my other books unless I'm forced to. This one I have already gladly read 3 or 4 times, and I have resolved to reread it frequently in the future." If one is to take Bellarmine at his word, then it seems that in his own estimation, his achievements as a spiritual writer and caretaker of souls outranked his work as a controversial theologian. Of course, he was not the only person to profit from his texts, which enjoyed a wide distribution in publication history. The Mind's Ascent, the first one, was translated several times in the very first year of publication, 1615. By 1930, there were 60 editions of the work in 15 languages, including English, French, German, Spanish, Russian, and even Chinese. Perhaps the most telling sign of the popularity of these works is that they were translated and widely read by Protestant readers. As one English bookseller declared, "I have made more money out of this Jesuit than out of all other divines put together." And this despite the government prohibition on Catholic books. Europe's thirst for Bellarmine's devotional texts, coupled with his positive appraisal of his own spiritual works, suggests that Bellarmine's impact in early modern Europe ought to be reassessed. Surely he was known by his controversies, his political theology, and role as inquisitor, but he was equally, if not more famous, for his spirituality. The vastly disseminated texts and well-attended sermons form the lived experience of Christian religion in early modern Europe. Teachings on the senses, in particular, were at the juncture between moral teaching and lived experience of religion. For this reason, the senses, their profitable application, and avoidance of improper use are a unified theme in Bellarmine's spiritual writings and sermons. They also form a cohesive purpose between his political, controversial, and spiritual works, insofar as he uses them to launch a defense of the validity of Catholic teaching, such as good works, and describes how misapplication of the senses actually corrupts the entire social order. Bear in mind that many of the attacks levied against Protestant reformers were on the basis of the misuse of the senses. For example, Johannes Barclayus, Luther's first Catholic biographer, charges the German with replacing guardianship of the senses through fasting with fleshly deeds. He says the Lutherans ate flesh and banqueted not out of necessity, but out of their unadulterated wantonness in defiance of the Church. Examining Luther's life, Barclayus rhetorically asks, what actually is there of sanctity or of a miracle that every evening after supper, sumptuously prepared and bountifully received, with belly stretched asunder by food and drink, Luther looked through the windows of his home and prayed a little bit? What is more, Barclayus accuses Luther of being an advocate for defiled lust. Now, this image here is attributed, or people claim is a Luther. No one knows for sure, but you find this, it's a little fountain in Rome. And it's quite near, by the way, the Roman college, the first Jesuit school. Anyway, it's clear that what Claes was picking up on is what some scholars today, such as Lyndall Roper and some contemporary Lutheran pastors, such as Nadia Bolz-Weber, have identified as Luther's earthiness. Federico Borromeo, a mentee of Paleotti, was equally horrified. He admonished artists to avoid nudity at all costs, because it can, I quote, offend the sensibilities of viewers and weaken their religious devotion. And to refrain from he also encouraged them to refrain from depicting saints' legs because unsuitable thoughts could steal into the viewers' souls. He even recommends foregoing biblical and historical accuracy to avoid nudity. So much for that. These are just a few. I mean, Saint Sebastian is portrayed all over Rome like this. The pincushion of the early church. For Borromeo, the images did not present danger by themselves, but the danger was in the eye of the excitable eye of a weak beholder. Another famous Jesuit preacher, Giovanni Paolo Oliva, echoed these concerns. The danger of art was a question of the susceptibility of human beings to succumb to the temptations of their senses. Temptation from nude figures in art, for example. Oliva was even more zealous in his exhortation to guard the senses. In a sermon on the feast of Luigi Gonzaga, he goes to great lengths to explain that abandoning vigilance of the senses, even momentarily, can have catastrophic consequences. For example, he implies a metaphorical fire to explain that one who practices constant vigilance cannot be burned. He says, no fire would have destroyed either the base or the body of the mausoleums of Egypt. Instead, one spark would have been enough to reduce the royal palace of David to ashes. The pyramid, of course, represents the person who practices custody of the senses, while David's palace is the soul that allows the senses to have free reign. In another sermon on Filippo Neri, Oliva specifically targets art, saying, the viewing of lascivious art, no matter how technically fine it may be, creates a veritable tempest within. Of course, this is a Michelangelo that was ultimately covered up. Okay? That loincloth was not there originally. The complication that I'm raising here is that many works of art seemingly do not live up to the pious expectations of preachers and art theorists. Nonetheless, many of these works survive, and some of them in public churches. A particularly problematic theme was that of the Saint in ecstasy. And if you didn't know that I'm Carlos' student, now you'll get the point. And it was as popular as it was troublesome. The genre frequently relied on sexually suggestive or erotic iconography to convey mystical scenes from the lives of holy men and women. We've already seen this, 1652. Some 30 years after the death of Robert Bellarmine, Bernini, who was a close personal friend of John Paolo Oliva, isn't that interesting, unveiled his masterpiece, St. Teresa in Ecstasy, revealing the intimate moment between visionary and the divine for the world to see. Bernini placed the saint before the eyes of the viewer with her robes elegantly draping her body, a cowl that mimics luscious locks of hair, her mouth is ajar, she has this wrinkle-free skin, youthful, delicate features, eyes rolling back, and her legs are spread. Meanwhile, a half-clad, pudgy cherub smiles sweetly over her. He wields, we talked about the dart before, but this is a golden arrow. And he pulls at her garments. What exactly was Bernini showing us? Does it avoid all lasciviousness and seductive charm as the Tridentine decree commanded? The ecstatic Teresa and its erotic overtones are well known. Jacques Lacan famously and bluntly proclaimed that the statue displayed an orgasmic woman. Those familiar with Teresa's own visceral account of ecstasy might posit that Bernini made every effort to render the saint's text faithfully in stone, as she describes, and Carlos quoted, and I guess I'm doing it too.
She says, "This cherub was very beautiful. In his hands I saw a long dart, the point of fire." I'll picture this more quickly so you heard it. "He seemed to pierce me several times and penetrating to my entrails. The pain made me utter several moans, and so excessive was the sweetness caused me by this intense pain that one can never wish to lose it." Teresa's description of this liminal experience, caught between heaven and earth, surpasses, some might say, erotic language in favor of language that seems sexual. It should be noted, as Alison Weber does, that Teresa's use of sexual language did not set her apart. It was common for mystics. Nonetheless, to say that Bernini's portrayal strove for textual accuracy is overstated. Bernini's Teresa breaks with the saint's text and the iconographic tradition. At the time of the Transfiguration, Teresa was 44 and endured the self-inflicted asceticism of the spiritual athletes for years and was accustomed to the coarse habit of a discalced Carmelite nun, donning simple sandals rather than bare feet. The angel who wields a golden arrow, as I tried to show earlier, is clearly Cupid, a paragon of lasciviousness and eroticism, not divine love. These idiosyncrasies are not accidental, but intentional and knowingly problematic. In Bernini's own day, the statue elicited various and divergent reactions. On the one hand, Giovanni Battista Passeri, an ardent critic of Bernini, commented on the Cornaro Chapel, saying, "It's a work of perfect beauty," so he was won over. On the other hand, a dissenter demurred the sculpture for transforming Teresa into a Venus who was not only prostrate, but prostituted as well. Passeri saw exquisite execution that delights the viewer with the illusion of its floating figures, their levitating. But others could not move beyond the stone's erotic overtures. As bold as Bernini, St. Teresa was, it was by no means unprecedented. The erotic iconography featured in Bernini's statue was already familiar to his audience. Similarly problematic images were commissioned in Rome and hung in public and private spaces for veneration and devotional use. In particular, what I'll do is highlight a few works of Caravaggio, who was Rome's most famous painter in the post-Tridentine period. I'll show how and why it might have been alluring to the likes of Robert Bellarmine and other preachers. By the way, it looks to me like Bernini knew very well this Magdalene in ecstasy. Caravaggio's Magdalene in ecstasy, which seems to be a model, as I said, seems to be a model for a later statue, was one of the more problematic images. Caravaggio's saint is in a typical Caravaggesque dark room, which perhaps alludes to the tradition of the Golden Legend, which affirmed that she spent the last decades of her life in a cave in southern France. Here she is in a reclining position. She folds her hands together on her stomach, and the light source reveals her exposed shoulders, arms, and chest. But she's otherwise clothed. Conversely, Titian's Magdalene portrays the saint in penitential nudity, covered only by her hair. It refers both to the legend that Mary's clothes disintegrated during her decades of aromatic life, as well as to the sexual nature of her sin. Giorgio Vasari, the father of art history, decried this image's eroticism. Surely, it was a far cry from Donatello's statue, in which the penitential nudity does not hint at eroticism at all. In comparison, Caravaggio problematized what Vasari already deemed erotic. The Magdalene's neck extends back so that her chin points up, revealing her half-open mouth and rolling eyes, while the darkness, privacy, and intimacy of the setting render the viewer a voyeur, not unlike the Cornaros, by the way, in the chapel who are looking down on Teresa's ecstasy. The Magdalene is barely conscious, yet she hardly seems the chaste woman converted to the life of the Gospels. The sexual nature of her sin is obvious instead. The link between these images is not the piety and spirituality of her subjects, but the artistic interpretation of the mystic, who's not in control, not conscious, who lies death-like, so between heaven and earth. Artemisia Gentileschi's Magdalene, which is a copy of Caravaggio's, is worthy of mention because it's by a female hand. A cursory reading might give it the impression that Gentileschi was sanitizing Caravaggio's iconography. Mary's face is more serene, with closed lips and eyes, and her folded hands rest upon her crossed legs. Differences in light sources also underscore the effect of the voyeurism in Caravaggio's image. Did Gentileschi attempt to capture Caravaggio's spiritual intensity without the overt sensuality? The posture of Gentileschi's Magdalene suggests that the answer is she did not. Her Magdalene, with the head tilting back and facial expression, conjures the seductive images of Gentileschi's classical beauties, known seductresses, Cleopatra and Danae. Furthermore, she retains similar posture and positioning of limbs for all three. Could the Magdalene be viewed as classical seductress? Quite possibly. Yet it must be noted that the image seduces, not the saint. The saint is lifeless. She cannot seduce any more than Cleopatra, moments away from death by lethal snake bite. Nonetheless, one wonders how viewers, trained to view images of saints as models for their own lives, reacted. What did these Magdalenes teach the viewers to do? In Caravaggio's St. Francis in Ecstasy, which was found in Connecticut, there aren't too many Caravaggios in the States, so if you ever get up there, it's really worth it. It's at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. He depicts Francis lying on the ground in the arms of an angel, wearing a traditional brown, perhaps Capuchin habit. Caravaggio's Francis is in a similar trance-like state. Francis's brow is furrowed and his limbs are uncomfortably splayed about. The half-clad angel that affectionately gazes at Francis while poised between his legs is a Caravagesque innovation in the artistic tradition and does not match textual records of Francis's stigmatization. There has been some debate about whether or not this image represents the stigmatization and its inherent reference to death. Pamela Askew and Howard Hibbard both interpreted it as such, but Bert Treffers disagreed. He linked the iconography of the image, especially the angel's firm grasp on Francis's belt, to the cult of the guardian angel preparing Francis for death. Might the angel's gesture be read a different way? Could the angel's embrace of Francis and firm grasp of his belt simultaneously refer to the cult of the guardian angel, Francis's evangelical vows, and also undressing? As evidence for this latter assertion, Caravaggio offers the protruding fold in Francis's habit, which seems to hint at arousal. And Francis's belt lacks the three nodes symbolic of evangelical vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. Additionally, as John Spike noted, the recumbent posture of the figures recalls the amorous Cupid. Some may ask, how could the beloved Saint Francis be portrayed thus? Despite the problems inherent in Caravaggio's depiction of the angel, it became an enduring part of the iconographic tradition. But future artists made many efforts to sanitize the erotic elements, as Rita Rani, Orazio Gentileschi, and Giovanni Baglioni's variations of the theme. This thing with saints, music, and angels is quite common. Carlos had an image a few moments ago with a similar theme. Rani separated the angel and the saint, featured Francis in a composed, albeit unconscious manner, and included the scene's traditional elements, such as the skull and the cross. Gentileschi's angel is fully clothed and braces himself to hold up the semi-conscious saint. The gesture cannot be confused for a tender embrace. Giovanni Baglioni, who, by the way, was a real critic of Caravaggio, he wrote a life of him, he was really not kind. Baglioni departs from Caravaggio's license by alluding to the institutional church and the symbolism of the keys of Peter. He also adds the implements of the Passion and common instruments of meditation, a crown of thorns, a book, and a skull. Furthermore, Francis's belt is corded and accompanied by a rosary. Baglioni's angel seemed to be dragging the saint rather than gently embracing. As Larry Feinberg noted, Baglioni's painting lacks the tenderness of Caravaggio's picture. What is clear is that artists interpreted their mandate to delight, instruct, and move souls in various ways. Some clung to the mandates of preachers and art theorists, while others seem to have wholeheartedly ignored them. we are left with some contradictory principles that only seem to open up more questions. These principles yielded two interrelated and complex issues at the heart of early modern Catholicism. Human beings are composed of sense organs. In the minds of Catholic theologians, the senses were gifts from God to enjoy creation, but also to help the soul move toward greater devotion and piety. At the same time, if those sense organs were used inappropriately, the results could be catastrophic. Therefore, moralists and preachers admonish Christians to engage with their senses, but they also caution them to be on guard. They fully expected artists to maintain this tradition. Art was supposed to be beautiful and elevate the mind to contemplation of God. It was not supposed to incite lust. Yet sometimes it did, as the preacher Bernardino of Siena lamented when he retold the story of the priest who, while saying Mass, he must have been looking at the altarpiece, saw the fullness of the Incarnation, Bernardino says, in an altar image and defiled himself. Sometimes artists depicted their subjects in terms far more earthbound than theologians would have liked. In these instances, they bemoaned that due to human frailty, exposure to sensuality through the sense of sight might result in untamed lust. What was an early modern art audience listening to a preacher like Robert Bellarmine and looking at Caravaggio's Magdalene in Ecstasy meant to think? Because surely somewhere these sorts of things happen. That's the question I hope to take forward in the next months. For today, what I submit to you is that we should not be surprised that the Christian life was taught and judged based on human action at the level of the senses. To this day, humans continue to explore how the senses relate to our interior selves as well as the world around us. For example, the therapeutic device known as a sensory deprivation chamber has become a popular tool recently. People who seek this kind of therapy submerge themselves, it sounds dreadful to me, submerge themselves in containers of water with no light and no sound in an effort to heighten their mental and psychological awareness. The chambers limit the distractions that the world presents us in favor of getting in touch with other elements of human experience. Of late, the senses have also been at the center of a few Hollywood thrillers. In the Netflix movie Bird Box, starring Sandra Bullock, no less, the world has been infested by demons who infiltrate the human psyche through sight, causing psychosis that leads to self-destruction. They commit suicide. The only defense against them is to close or cover the eyes. Similarly, in the film A Quiet Place, starring John Krasinski, noise and sounds alert and attract vicious and demonic forces. Therefore, strict maintenance of silence is the only way to deter them. Notice how in both instances, only careful custody of the senses repels the demons. It is the perfect visual representation of some themes in this paper. Dare I ask, how far from Robert Bellarmine